wanted to welcome you for this gallery reflection, last gallery reflection. Usually it's super nice for me because I make a quick introduction and then I throw the mic and he continues and I'm just sitting and listening what's happening, learning, taking notes. But for the first time, I have to talk about all of these notes. We have to reflect on the gallery reflections. This is where we are now. It's interloop. So I promised to Annika that I won't disturb her before the end of the talk so that she explains a little bit more this whole program that she elaborated with Eve. And it's really incredible because it's a very difficult task to talk about the archive, to talk about the Kunstvermittlung program in a space like this where the exhibition, where the exhibition is a starting point of a whole conversation that we've been having for more than a year now on the colonial structure and the everyday. And we decided not to just exhibit objects, talk about one piece. As I was saying, we wanted to go beyond the format of the exhibition. We wanted to go beyond the moment of also what happens when there is an exchange. So it triggered a lot of questions about what everything that has been shared here, how does it stay? How do we write it in a kind of continuity? And for that, I would like to thank Anna, who has been documenting the whole public program that we had. Yes, so as I was saying, the structure of the whole year of research and exhibition format, this untie to tie, the first phase, looking at colonial legacies and contemporary societies, you had the exhibition space as starting point of a conversation that would last one chapter, so more or less 3 months, where you had this platform where different people were sharing their stories. Different people with different backgrounds, meaning you would have an artist, an anthropologue, a curator, a performer, many different approaches. And each one of them was bringing his forms of knowledges and experiences and stories on these colonial legacies, this colonial structure, how they impact the everyday. Part of the series, part of this encounter is the series, the gallery reflection. And it started as a very, very egoistic approach for me because I knew that I don't know anything alone and I need I need sparring partners. And we had a lot of conversation about it with Hannah and Annika at the very, very beginning of the elaboration of the Colonial Legacies and Contemporary Society program. But we all realized that we need to have something on a more meta level to understand for us what are we talking about. And I will make it very easy for you from the beginning. We still don't know, and we are going to discuss about it with you later on. What are these words that are being used? What does it mean when we're talking about decoloniality, post-colonialism, colonial legacies? What does it mean for an approach, for an anthropologist, for a curator, for an artist? What does it mean when we're talking about intersectional feminism, for instance? So all of that, the idea today where we are all together is really to reflect on that. So it's not like a formal presentation that we're going to have. It's more a discussion, a reflection, again, on this, yes, gallery reflection. So now I can give you the mic and you continue.
I've got my own mic here, which might work, might not work. I think it does. Also thanks for coming from me and welcome to our last event in this series, which technically speaking was already the one before. As you've already said, we're situated at the moment, and we'll hear more about that later, in an exhibition that reflects, in sort of a space that reflects on, as you said, a whole year, actually more than a year really, of events, of exhibitions, of performances, of conversations. And I think that this particular frame here, this interloop, is really wonderful because it allows you not only to think back about the things that have happened, the wonderful films, the wonderful photographs, the wonderful performances, but it's also a chance really to be honest and reflect about some things that may not have gone so well, to reflect on some of the the ways in which you can learn. And I suppose that was one of the reasons why we chose to give today's event the title Anthropology, Vulnerability and Curatorial Practice. Anthropology for obvious reasons, I'll get to those in a moment, because I'm an anthropologist, and this actually began from my perspective, perhaps a really inquisitive, curious question about this gallery. Vulnerability in the etymological sense of making yourself more open or possible for attack. Not necessarily in a physical sense, but really just to expose yourself a little more, and actually to open, at least on a conceptual level, some of your premises, to lay them bare and actually to expose yourself to conversation about them. And curatorial practice, well, quite simply because this is really, I think, the ground, the shared space around which we've been discussing a lot of different issues throughout this whole year that we'll get into in a moment. So, anthropology, again, to lay it bare a little bit, really the first time that I encountered this gallery was in an exhibition that actually was here before the Untie to Tie program began, with other eyes, with different eyes, mit anderen Augen, which is also the title of a wonderful essay by the philosophical anthropologist Helmut Plessner. This exhibition, however, was about the photographer Johannes Heily, and it really raised issues about perspectives on self and other. It was an exhibition about the official UN photographer from Ethiopia who came to take photographs in his own spare time of the GDR and of West Berlin. And this really threw up very interesting questions about being observed, observing others, and so on. I walked into this gallery, though, because I began 2 years ago a research project at the Humboldt University here in the Institute of European Ethnology, which is trying to understand how curators of contemporary art in Berlin are using different kinds of institutional spaces to negotiate essentially the role and future of what you could call anthropological questions. That is to say, questions about human diversity, questions about communities, about living together, questions also about how we deal with human difference and similarity. And I'm putting it partly in that way because the backdrop to this study is this absurdly large and institution that has kind of overcast discussions about cultural politics in Berlin in the last few months, even years or decades, the Humboldt Forum, which of course is at the moment raising all kinds of issues about how Germany and Europe deals with so-called non-European heritage and art. And I felt that there are spaces beyond the Museum Island that are really generating particularly interesting questions and ways of dealing with issues of representation, otherness and alterity. And Alya's program here was one of them. And so I walked in and suggested that we somehow start a conversation. That conversation then very quickly led into one of the key words for us, which is collaboration. Because we thought how, anthropologists are often seen as those, nerdy individual people who walk somewhere, take notes in the backdrop, don't want to talk to people, just would rather take notes about them. And that perception and that practice has shifted in recent years, and people have realized that actually, if you want to engage with some of the problematic assumptions of anthropology as a science implied in the colonial enterprise, as a science associated often with the objectification of others as well, then you really need to address the discipline through dialogic, collaborative practices. And working on curatorial practices in Berlin, therefore obviously also meant speaking with and somehow trying to establish collaborative practices.
So in a way, the deal was we're not object, we become subject of conversation. And that was the whole deal of the gallery reflection. And on that, I think when you were talking about this new approach of anthropology and about this conversation and this ongoing dialogue, it's also something that we were very interested in, because of course when we're talking about colonial legacies, and there is like the label and the whole approach, that what we have been trying to do is to deconstruct the labels. one of the label where you have anthropology, of course, it's scary at the beginning because you don't know how to react to that. And the openness and the way of saying, no, we think about that together. It's not writing on you as a gallery what the program is going to be, but it's thinking together, and it's this sharing, these forms of knowledge that are being shared. That what was extremely interesting for on our side too. So that's also how the whole collaboration started.
And I should also say, although this is perhaps a slightly more conceptual or theoretical point, that one of the particular moments in which at least I situate my interest in curatorial practices, and I think where we met, and also where we met with others that are also part of this research project, such as Galerie Wedding and Savvy Contemporary, where we're sort of situating this particular practice in a moment that has been described, for better or for worse, by Irit Rogoff, as the expanded field of curatorial practice. And what she means by that is that curatorial practice is no longer about a particular craftsmanship of the exhibition of objects, but has actually become something which she describes as the staging of the development of an idea, by which she means that essentially you're exposing the process of thinking through an idea. That itself becomes part of the curatorial process. And I think that this kind of reflexive and recursive way to think about the very meaning of curating, the very meaning of institutional spaces, was one that attracted us and prompted us to think of a way in which we could at once think about the specific context here in Berlin and some of the issues raised by your program, but also actually interrogate the space itself, which admittedly, and this is also part of our conversation perhaps, is relatively difficult because certain kinds of structures always get reproduced even if you don't plan them, such as the fact that for some reason now we're sitting 10 feet away from everybody else. Which,
we've been trying.
which I attribute to the comfortable couch area, which everybody should be sitting on. But there are also more seats here at the front, so some people can also take those. But just so much about really the theoretical context of that as well. The other thing that I think we wanted to say about the notion of vulnerability and the idea of destabilizing anthropological practice on the one hand, and perhaps certain normative assumptions about institutions such as galleries and curatorial practice, was that what we had in mind when we think about vulnerability or destabilization is actually encapsulated in the title of your program, Untie to Tie. So we were interested in a kind of destabilization or a questioning of each other's positions that would not lead to a sort of postmodern chaos where we're totally lost and don't know who we are anymore, but actually would lead to a kind of recalibration. That is to say, again, to untie, to unravel some of the assumptions of each of our positions and practices, to tie them together in a more stable and more interesting way. Or as it was put in a review of a film about James Baldwin recently, to decenter, to recenter. That is to say, to get oneself out of one's position in order to look at that position again and find a better, more apt one.
And on that, sorry, but this part of decenter and recenter, it's already in 2015 when I was invited to curate an exhibition in the ifa-Galerie. While I was doing the Marrakech Biennial, the exhibition was called Carrefour, and it was Marrakech Biennial darüber and Marrakech Biennial in beyond, and it was asking this question of the center, and rather than being in this ongoing for very still conversation of center versus periphery, the standpoint was that the center is the one from each one. It's a very, it's an individual position. It's the center from which we speak. So my center is different than yours, and it corresponds to my own individual mapping. And it's this subjective position from which I speak. And that inspired the whole program in the ifa-Galerie. So this Untie-to-Tie program is bringing together, like creating moments of encounters between these different trajectories. Here's for decentering, recentering.
And speaking of these different trajectories, I think one of the things that we also wanted to do in today's session, knowing that some of you have been involved actually in some of the previous iterations and some of you may not have been, we're briefly going to talk through actually the 4 sessions that we've had, just mentioning who was there, really also giving thanks on the one hand, but also just giving you a sense of how they evolved. Because the idea of these gallery reflections, again, part of the title, or the idea is in the title, was that they wouldn't just be accompanying each of the different chapters, that is to say, the exhibitions, but that they would somehow crisscross between the different themes, anticipating, thinking back, and also, in a sense, and that's why I'm glad that some people are here who asked the very first question at the very first event. This format, which wasn't fixed at the beginning, allowed us to take into account comments and criticisms from previous events into the next one. Anyway, so we began with the first gallery reflection. These are slides, by the way. That's why they look slightly terrible in terms of resolution. These are slides from the video documentation that has been made by Anik Joyce, Sadiq, and Hannah Prenzel. That is all online. So all of these different events, including the questions and intros, you can find on YouTube by just typing in the title of these. So, accompanying the first chapter of last year's program and the exhibition by Cameroonian artist Pascal Martin Taillou that you can see in the background that was dangerously threatening the back of our heads during this conversation, we devised a panel on the question of urban diasporas and decolonial thought. And key for us here was to combine questions about hidden ways of seeing urban space with a discussion of Asian, and that meant here in particular Korean, Vietnamese, and Indonesian diasporic formations. This was an issue actually that was very dear to us, partly inspired by the fact that, again, as I mentioned, the Humboldt Forum, a large complex being built, is often discussed mainly through the Ethnological Museum, while it will also be including a significant museum, the Museum of Asian Art, that is sort of sidelined by discussions. And we felt that these significant positions and thoughts about post-colonial diasporas need to be reflected. And so we invited scholar and activist Noah Ha, anthropologist Chang Tran Tu, and performer Hyun-Shin Kim for this event. And while themes of space, which is really sort of the reference to the first chapter, were also crucial to debates about art and colonial, post-colonial experience, so we thought were issues of time and temporality. And those we discussed in our second gallery reflection on September 7th, 2017, entitled Traces, Legacies and Futures, a conversation on art and temporality. And for this conversation, I invited Berlin-based artist Nora Al-Badri, Berlin-based anthropologist Sylvie Chakalakal, and London-based art historian and artist Khadija von Zinnenburg-Carroll, really to poke at and interrogate the temporal dimensions of some of the concepts that we use to talk about the colonial past, present and future. So what we were interested in really was to ask, what does it mean to speak of colonial legacies, of colonial traces? You know, what are some of the assumptions that we use in terms of temporality when we speak of post-colonialism? In what sense should we speak of continuities, or even of anticipated colonialisms, neo-colonialisms that are emerging, crypto-colonialisms? What we also talked about, and that's why I was really fond of the fantastic contributions by my interlocutors in this session, we also spoke about objects. In particular, objects, and this relates to the work that Nora Al-Badri has done with her artistic partner in arms, Nikolai Nellis. They've been involved in a project that I think was called the Nefertiti hack, or at least has become known as such, which some of you may know about, which essentially dealt with something that they described as techno-heritage. That is to say, heritage produced for the future, or produced to poke institutions to be thinking about future ways of sharing and dealing with heritage. And these two guys are really, at the moment, I think, at a crux of how to deal with objects, restitution, provenance in an age in which we have advanced technological possibilities for sharing and digitizing objects. The third gallery reflection, which took place in mid-November, was called Art and New Intersectional Feminisms, and took place in the context of the exhibition which was guest curated by Eva Barrois de Cavel, presenting a solo show and performances by Nigerian-American artist Wura Natasha Ogunji. And as part of this conversation, we were speaking with Kathy Ann Tan, who is an American scholar based in Berlin, author and editor Federica Buetti from Savvy Contemporary, and curator Anna Lockwood. And in this session we spoke, amongst other things, about issues that we're going to be talking about a little bit more, such as alliances and solidarity, how to integrate, that is to say, really existing projects, existing reflections of previous generations of scholars who've been thinking, for instance, in this case, about intersectionalism and feminism in Berlin and abroad. And then, just to wrap it up, the fourth and last kind of reflection in our series took place in exile over in the Akut studio, and was framed by the last chapter curated by Natasha Ginwala. And that took place under the title Protesting Identities, which is a reference to the show's theme and focus on riots, but was really also trying to poke at this double meaning of protesting identities. That is to say, at the idea that identities can be used and mobilized strategically to protest certain kinds of inequalities, but that identities are also challenges that are sometimes protested themselves. The idea of reified identities, of non-hybrid identities. And for this conversation, I invited the theater scholar Azadeh Sharifi, the South African artist Candice Breitz, and Natasha Ginwala herself to talk through these issues. Yeah, that really was just a brief run-through of the various events that we've had in this series.
I think connected to that and to when we were talking about the vulnerability and the openness, it's also how each one influenced the next one, and how the first gallery reflection, when we had the questions, and that, for instance, Alana Lockwood was asking this when we were talking about space, when she was asking about the heritage, like what happened with people, pardon, who have been involved, like about this idea that it seems to be all the time a rediscovery that we're talking about colonial legacy nowadays, but what about people who have been so involved into that already 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and rather than again all the time erasing, pretending nothing happened, like when we're talking about legacies, let's talk about legacies on that. And that also inspired then the topic of the second gallery reflection. And then on the third gallery reflection, we invited Alana to talk about her practice as within the global frame of intersectional feminism. And now we are collaborating for the Bebop Festival with Alana, curated by Alana, with an event, 2 events happening in the ifa-Galerie. So again, about this approach of when we're talking about vulnerability, yes, we open ourselves to criticism, we open completely to, like, it's an ongoing way when we are thinking, and we are thinking with, we know that it's not one person or 2 persons who are going to solve the questions that are being asked. It's by bringing different people all the time and learning together, and not just closing it within like the Q&A, yeah, interesting question, thank you very much. No, it's how can we continue, how can we work together in the future? And I think that was a very good example of that.
And in that same vein, in particular, because as we said, we're now at an exhibition and in a session dedicated really to reflecting on some of the crossroads and developments of this series, which really wasn't planned out from the beginning, we have to admit, and that was also deliberately so, we'll say now. But one of the events that really helped us think through some of these issues was actually a very kind invitation by two colleagues. Shout out to them, Alex Flynn and Noara Quintana, an anthropologist and an artist who at the time had a residency at the Cité des Arts, partnered with the EHESS in Paris. And they had invited us to Kada Atia's fantastic space, La Colonie, in Paris, which is a space dedicated in a number of different ways, discursively, performatively, and so on, to think through, in a sense, the continued legacies of colonialism. And that event really afforded us to a conversation about this gallery reflection series that I think tackles three concepts that we wanted to talk about a little bit more. The first one being really the emergence of discourses. And I say that partly because it was speaking about specific conversations that are being had by institutions, by scholars, by artists in Berlin, and looking at that from a different kind of city just makes you realize again and again how, as you already said, certain discourses seemingly are being reinvented and don't give credit to the generations of people who've been thinking about them before, which was something that we've been trying to address in every single conversation, that we're not inventing any new concepts here. We're really just trying to learn, in a sense, and trying to bring together different people who've been involved in previous generations of reflection and activism, but also to see how we can find different vocabularies to speak, for instance, about heritage through, as I said, new technologies. And that conversation, I suppose, also triggered us to think about this idea of collaboration in a different sense. Not just collaboration, as we said, between an anthropologist and a curator, but also the significance of establishing and recognizing alliances with existing other institutions in a given space, which was one of the reasons why we were so keen to bring Alana Lockwood into this conversation, who is so deeply connected to the bebop, which is why we were so keen to establish and build on existing conversations with the project space Savvy Contemporary, and which is why we were so keen to try and establish other kinds of such alliances, because what we felt really was that we live in a time in which, for some reason, critical thought and critical reflection has become exploited. You can blame this on neoliberalism, you can blame this on Monika Grütters, you can blame this, I don't know on whom, but has some key words, decoloniality, post-colonialism and restitution provenance, other issues, artistic critique and so on. They've become exploited by political agendas, by funding projects and so on that are really trying to make it easy. And we thought that that was something which you need to reflect on by thinking across alliances rather than seeing other institutions as competitors in this field for visibility.
And on that, not only this, but how to make sure that it's not a specific window of time, so that now the hip thing would be to talk about decoloniality and post-colonialism and colonial legacies, and in 2 years the next hip thing will be to talk about the color red or something like this. So how do we make sure that it's something that stays constant, and how actually an institution can be, and through different forms. I'm not talking only about the ifa-Galerie, and that's also what is interesting, the fact that you are working with the Galerie Wedding and with Savvy, how we make sure that it is something that remains. And voilà, so this.
We'll get to that point in a moment again. The other point I think that we also tried to recognize was really this, it has to do with the idea of collaboration, and in particular with the way in which over the last 20 years, perhaps since Hal Foster's been writing about it in the 90s, collaborations between artists and anthropologists, artists and scholars, curators and anthropologists has really become a common trope. Artistic research has been drawing on notions like ethnography and so on and so forth, and those have often been framed in the literature, in public events, as a sort of seamless sort of collaboration, as one where you can very easily, as an artist, use anthropological methods, and as anthropologists, use exhibitions and other kinds of means of producing. And what we thought, and this is kind of inspired by an article written by the anthropologist Arndt Schneider, where he says that really what we need to recognize and be honest about are the unevennesses of our collaborations. That is to say, when we speak about talking to one another at eye level, what we often do is we disregard the very obvious and constantly persistent differences in terms of institutional background, institutional support, in terms of the kinds of different capital and privileges, unsustainable and otherwise, that we bring with us. And I think part of that really was also a means for us to try and think about, again, an institution such as IFA, where Alya has been trying to establish a kind of relative autonomy, but that nonetheless is associated with larger institutions such as the Institut für Auslandsbeziehungen, connected to Auswärtiges Amt and so on and so forth. So really it's interesting to think about, hence the word gallery reflections, about the affordances and difficulties of certain institutional spaces to allow for moments of reflection. And this is actually, in a sense, also a moment at which we are going to come closer once we've stopped speaking and want to engage in conversations with you, knowing already from seeing some people here that you've been engaging in very different kinds of institutions and contexts in which you have been trying both to interrogate the institution itself, but also to create new moments of reflection and collaboration. And so I think that for us, this was an experiment. We're definitely not pretending to have any answers about collaborations between art and anthropology and curatorial practice, but we're really just trying out one possible way of doing it. That's one thing about that word. Did you want to add anything on? Because then maybe we could move on. You already alluded to the word. One of the reasons why we're sitting in this corner wasn't because we wanted to be as far away as possible from the entrance, but was actually because we were wandering around, and one of the words that struck us was archive, archive, and I actually misread one of them as archiving. But anyway, we'll just imagine that there's another verb form of the word here. And the reason why we chose this is because another aspect of what we're interested in and what you've been trying to do with this whole year actually has been to think about productive ways of archiving. To put this differently is, on the one hand, how do you archive what Irit Rogoff described as the staging of the development of an idea? How do you archive performance-based discursive programs that try and interrogate an institution? How do you archive and make accessible at a later stage for critical reflection, but also for possible connections, things that are ephemeral, that are discursive, without just making video documentation, which of course is part of that. And so how do you archive these on the one hand, but also, and again, these are questions because we don't really have answers to them, how do you archive, or how do you establish a record of the emergence and genealogy of particular discourses, such as the ones that we mentioned around post-colonial challenges to institutions? How do you really grasp, without being an art historian in 20 years who's going to write articles about the now or the 2017, 18, I don't know what years in Berlin or in Germany? How do you create an accessible memory that is not tucked away in libraries of these kinds of moments?
It was one of the challenge and one of the big difficulty of now this interloop, and that's why, like, when we talk about archives, like how do we talk about it within an exhibition space? That's one thing, and the other thing is with the work of Hannah and Annike with the digital platform, to keep all of that, all of these encounters available. But for that, I think we still try to have it continuous. But for that, I think I would like to ask Annika to tell us a little bit, a couple of words about the interloop, because, yeah, as I said in the beginning, for those who were not here, Annika and Eve have been developing this whole program where we are in at the moment, this interloop program, and it's 3 weeks of encounters where we are on the one hand reflecting on what has been happening during this first phase of program and research on colonial legacies and contemporary societies, and then also in the same time making more public what has been happening for the art and education program. So I know I promised by the end, it's not the end, but please if you can say a couple of words.
Yeah, I will make it very shortly because you're inside the space and you have the chance for 2 more days to dive into the program. The basic idea to use this interloop was to take time and space. We have a platform here usually where you're sitting right now, where we have the digital platform and the chance to contextualize the materials with questions which would be here, put together by Hannah and Annike, who did the video documentation of the program and questioning these materials. Then we had a challenge to look into the visual archive with photographs of Viktoria Tomaszko, who is behind doing the next part of documentation today, with a very huge archive of photography, which was amazing. And we have a very small insight, but I think it's narrating a good story about this year on this wall. And each chapter was accompanied by a sound landscape of sonic panoramas by Saud Radio. And as we thought during the chapters, it was not so much space and time maybe to have the context between the 3 of them, where you can have the chance now to listen again. But the basic idea was not really to represent the archive, but to share the archive. So the focus was really on events and workshops happening each week. And each week we had another focus. So the first week was about sound, and we had a sound workshop, drawing sounds in this exhibition space and having a talk on sound education afterwards. The second week was focused on readings, because we had a seminar with the UDK on school books and revisiting school books with an anti-racist and anti-discriminatory way. And we had a workshop on this topic, again here on the workshop table. And the last week is now, and tomorrow you're very welcome. You have the chance to experience the last workshop, which will kind of make the link to the next program. I think you will mention this maybe in the end, which will maybe, don't know if I'm allowed to announce it, which will be Anti-to-Tie focused on movement. And I welcome Daniela, who's in the public sitting with us right now. She and Oscar from the School of Valparaiso invite us tomorrow for a promenade, moving outside the gallery space to the neighborhood, and to link this with poetry and design, and give some insight in the practice of knowledge transfers and material transfers in her school in Valparaiso. Yeah, so you're welcome to join, and I'm here for questions.
At 5 tomorrow was added. And that actually allows as really perhaps a concluding remark before we go into...
One more thing for the archive. Yes, there was a lot of also conversation and inspiration by people, initiative, institutions who have been deeply involved on this question on archiving. And one of them that we have been already talking about is Savi, and they did this project a few weeks ago. They opened this project during the Dakar Biennial, which was also dealing with the question of archive and how to really make sure that the archive does not stay something really dusty, but is something alive we can learn from and with all the time. And I would like also to say how inspiring it has been when talking and dealing with the question of our archive, their whole practice there.
And as I said, as a concluding remark, perhaps, and as a transition into conversation, just because it picked up from what Annika was saying, the Gallery Reflections will actually transition into a different format that hopefully will be able to take on comments and criticism and so forth. Under the title, All is Flux, Nothing Stands Still, Again, taking up this concept of movement in the double sense of movement in the sense of migration and movement in the sense of performance. And what will happen I won't be in conversation anymore with 3 people, but with just 1 person in a satellite space outside of the gallery. So we'll be moving into different kinds of spaces that deal with and accompany the different chapters of next year's program. How that will be made available, we'll see. We'll keep it deliberately flexible. And yeah, with that, I think I would like to thank you for putting on this whole program. And yeah, we're open for questions and comments.
Attends, before I take the mic, one last second and then I stop. But on movement, next year is actually in a few weeks, and we open on June 1st with the exhibition curated by Bavisha Panchia, who is desperately trying to hide behind, but who is here with us, and it will be with the exhibition For the Record, and we are extremely looking forward to seeing it. Thank you very, very much, and I look forward to the next step. And now, as we said from the beginning, it's a conversation really with all of you, and we want to learn from your experiences on that and your feedback. So, voilà, please don't be shy. Please have, if you need, a glass of wine or a glass of water. But we're really here to share and learn from you. Merci.
I don't know if it's still here in the gallery, but you had this amazing book installation that was kind of like with magazines and books. Is it still, I don't know if it's still here, but I wonder also how that project will develop, or if it's something, because you speak about flux and movement, if it's something that people are constantly working on, or because I think that's a perfect example of archiving and a curated archiving, and yeah, I'm curious to hear more about that one.
Thank you for this question. It's the reading room. You're talking about the reading room that was curated by Yvette Mutumba and Julia Gross from the contemporary end, and yes, one of the starting point of the conversation was the exhibition, but there was also the reading room and the hearing station. And the reading room, it was through a selection of publications that were dealing with these colonial legacies nowadays, and a selection of video clip. And it has been present during the whole 2017, and then in 2018. Académie der Kunst is doing a whole program, a year-long program dealing with colonial legacies, and they have the first event was happening in January. They have one event coming up at the end of the month, I think on the 27th of May, another one in June. So again, about this idea of movement, collaboration and continuation, the Center of Unfinished Business is now at the Académie der Kunst and will stay there for the whole year as well.
Thank you for the very nice presentation. Super happy to be here, and so it was a very nice sort of overarching summary of all what happened over these first 4 sessions, which I missed. But maybe to just come back a little bit to today's topic of one of the topic, vulnerability. And to make it a bit more concrete, maybe in the reflection about it, if you would agree to maybe say a few words about what it could mean in each of your positions. I mean, not very personally, but I guess in terms of institutional position, and if having discussed that already together, some interesting tensions or unevenness, like you were saying, emerge from that, and you could learn something from that. Thanks.
I just start with actually the word the vulnerability was inspired by the work of the curator Chiara Bertola, and she's the director of the Fondazione Querini Stampaglia in Venice, and she did an exhibition called Terre Vulnerabili. So it was a growing exhibition that lasted, I think, 4 years, or at least in 4 phases, where rather than being in a relationship as a spectator with the finished exhibition, it was still ongoing. So you never have like this kind of final result. And she wrote a text about like what's her approach of vulnerability. I don't know it by heart, but I wrote it. I was expecting this kind of question. And she says that this theme is vulnerability in its deepest and most diverse aspect. Vulnerability is that entirely unique ability humans possess to empathize, to recognize their own fragility and accept their ethical responsibilities towards others, towards the community, and towards the environment. And actually, I was invited to a symposium organized by the Karma Institute. And at some point, I started to talk about the empathy. And it was very interesting to see the reaction when using the word empathy in a talk like it was. And it was, let's say, it disturbed a lot, the fact to talk about, when you're talking about your curatorial practice, to talk about vulnerability and empathy. And so we started to discuss about that and to try to understand where was this kind of malaise coming from. And also, there was another person who inspired me on that, but that was a late discovery in Dhaka, who his words gave some inputs about this malaise. It's Felwine Sarr, and he wrote about this crisis of relationality. And so it's in French, bear the awful translation. He says that notions such as compassion, solidarity, or generosity are not only working as a minority, but they are undervalued, and it becomes something like a stupid optimism. They are read as a stupid optimism. And I think neither vulnerability or empathy is something like it's not a naivete, it's a conviction. And that's how I like to work in this gallery, and that's how I like to exchange. And that was, at least for me, the starting point of why talking about the vulnerability.
In a sense, one of the other reasons why we came back to vulnerability was because one of the earliest terms that we began with, and the opening essay that explains or lays out the framework for this whole series, which is on the website, was called sparring partners. And that metaphor, which is drawn from the brutal sport of boxing, admittedly, sparring partners are essentially people who don't intend to harm each other physically, but to train, make each other more alert, and also sensitivize the other person to one's movements. And while that may sound like a slightly neutralized way of thinking about sparring, the idea behind that, and in fact this concept was inspired was inspired by a conversation that emerged in a different field context, in a different research context that I'm comparatively working in, a context of a conversation with the curator and founder of Savvy Contemporary, Bonaventure Ndikong, with whom I've been entertaining a series of conversations about key words from A to Z between anthropology and curating. And he described our encounter as one between sparring partners, saying that actually what we need to do is to expose ourselves and our concepts, make them vulnerable in a sense to critique. And one of the reasons why, maybe that doesn't sound surprising or new to some people, but anyone who's worked seriously in academic institutions and has tried to publish in academic journals and outlets knows how overly protective some of these institutions and outlets and ways of writing are to critique. First of all, they're usually not even accessible by a lot of people who don't have access to certain kinds of journals and so on and so forth. And so really the idea of vulnerability and sparring partner and so on was, from my point of view as an anthropologist, the idea to go ahead and say, look, what I write, what I think, is subject to critique and should be made subject to critique, not just with my academic peers, but actually with the people with whom and about whom I write. And so very practically, part of that is, for me, that anything that I write about this encounter, anything I write about other institutions with whom I work, I share prior to publication, so that we have a conversation about some of the assumptions and some of the arguments that I'm trying to lay out. Because I'm not interested in establishing an othering account of others, but actually in reframing the kind of research I do as one that is between peers and epistemic partners with whom I can have an argument about my and your assumptions.
How also the program was taught is when we are questioning the construction of universalism, of one single truth, the super-rational approach of reality, when we are questioning also all of these labels and categorization, we also know that we are still looking for other terminologies. We are still like constructing together these terms. So it's also, there is no one objective and one final truth in this whole program of the gallery. So it cannot not be vulnerable. And that's also exactly what is happening now. So at the beginning when I was telling you, we don't know and we still haven't found the answers, but it's through this whole format of experimentation that this vulnerability helps. So yes, I think it has been, at the end, that has been the red thread of the whole program.
And maybe just as one final thing about this, it also works on a conceptual level. And what I mean by that is that quite often particular fields of knowledge production, be they curatorial studies, be they art history, anthropology, are quite protective of the particular kinds of terms that they use. And although, of course, there's been a long phase of interdisciplinary research in which it's been all about learning from other disciplines, there is nonetheless a particular resistance to taking seriously the concepts and words and practices of other people beyond your particular discipline or your field. And so to translate that into the practice of anthropological work, which is very often based, for those that don't know, about around the accompaniment of practices and institutions, what that has to do, what that means for me is that, for instance, to use an institution we've been referring to a lot because it's an inspiring partner, Savvy Contemporary, is opening an exhibition very soon, in fact this Friday, about the notion of hospitality, or rather hospitality, that is to say the relationship between hostility and hospitality. Hospitality has been one of the key terms in anthropology since its emergence in the 19th century. And what making yourself vulnerable and means for me as an anthropologist also means to take very seriously the kind of conceptual reframing and the generation of new concepts and ideas about anthropology beyond anthropology in other fields.
I was wondering, so you addressed the issue of being made an object, which has been very prominent in anthropology, but also in galleries. You exhibit things, and that has also has a colonial problematic history. And I wonder what use or how, in what way you think galleries can still be useful, and maybe in particular relationship to archiving. But yeah, also given that difficult relationship with representation and making object, and how can one become a subject in a gallery, and also considering that galleries are usually can be still very exclusive spaces. That is one question, and also kind of tied to that, how you navigate the space of collaborating with certain institutions like the Humboldt Forum that you mentioned. Like, where do you draw synergies, and where do you maybe where's the collaboration more, what are the benefits and what are the problems basically in collaborating with certain institutions?
Since Alya is going to answer the first question, I'm going to respond to the second one. Briefly, perhaps, because I don't officially collaborate or work with any individual institution in the Humboldt Forum. What I would like to say, though, is that as an anthropologist of cultural institutions, what I'm interested in is not necessarily just an evaluation or a judgment of how they work, but to try and understand the complexity of some of the decision-making processes involved. And for anyone who's seen this rather hilarious and actually slightly sad diagram that Jörg Henschel, perhaps one of the best witnesses of this whole palaver about the Humboldt Forum, has made in an early article, the name of which I forgot. It's a diagram that tries to map the different players involved in the Humboldt Forum, and it just looks like a Jackson Pollock painting. You will soon understand that a lot of people, especially on a curatorial level in each of these institutions, are fighting desperately to get through some of their very critical ideas and very advanced ideas about the representation of non-European cultures. And that is very often cut short by other kinds of issues, hierarchization, institutional hierarchies and so on and so forth. And there is a very interesting article by someone who's actually crossed that border, Friedrich von Bose, who's an anthropologist who studied the Humboldt Forum for several years and its emergence, and then became the curator of the Humboldt University part in the Humboldt Forum. And he has written an article, I think it's called Strategische Reflexivität, Strategic Reflexivity, in which he's trying to reflect on the ways in which you can or can't act critically within such institutions.
We also don't work with the Humboldt Forum, so there is no collaboration with the Humboldt Forum, even though I think it would be interesting to open this conversation and to involve people who are working within the Humboldt Forum, because rather than preaching the converted, as Yvette Mutumba, one of the co-curator of the Center of Unfinished Business, this reading room says, it's opening different subjectivities also, and being open to frictions and tensions, but at least it's a creative conversation, something constructive comes out of it, but we don't. That being said, you mentioned several points. I will try to list them to make sure I noted everything. So you were talking about the gallery as an exclusive space. You were talking about this relationship of object and subject. Yes, whether the gallery can be a useful institution, and then there was something about the archive. But
just asking about with the history of exhibiting and that being connected to anthropology and museums, for example. What is how can we use galleries? How are galleries useful today in creating or in more positive representations, I guess, or I'm not quite sure how to phrase that, but in not engaging in the same making people into objects. Yeah.
What the Anti-to-Type program was working on several piliers. So one of them, you had the exhibition as a starting point of a conversation. With the exhibition, you had the hearing station that you still can listen to some of them here. You had the reading room that I was telling you about for this Center of Unfinished Business. So all of them being in tension or in conversation. And around that, you had the whole public program. So all of these encounters and the gallery reflection being one of them. And all of these moments were being all the time in connection with, in the digital platform. And on the digital platform, there was a documentation of these encounters, but there were also, we were commissioning text, so something that was all the time in the making, in the moving. About the question of the representation, it's something that we are very aware of, and we try, rather than talking about representation, and for that I would like to thank Nicola Hartel, who has been also very inspiring on that. She suggested the ideas and the writing of Walter Mignolo, who, by the way, he is coming here for a workshop on the 4th, a small moment of advertising, but he has been, he prefers, rather than talking about representation, it's the option of enunciation. And it's something that is all the time moving. Before, when I was telling about this, the center from which I speak, it's different than yours, but it will be moving from one point to the other one. So I think we try as much as possible, and it's still an experimentation, to get rid of the fixed aspect of one object, one representation. We try to break that. And because it is a difficult exercise, and because also we don't have the answers how it functions, yes, there is this, it's a vulnerable approach. We try, but it's important element for us that we will try to continue in the next years.
I think there are other questions, but as you pass the microphone, maybe, of course, a gallery is also just an institution that can be filled with any kind of idea or person. I think that's perhaps the most important thing to say, that of course there are certain barriers, but you can fill them very, very differently.
Thank you. So to me, it's also very interesting and inspiring that you brought in this term of vulnerability, especially in connection with the whole archive theme. So both in terms of like how to access an archive and how to do something, might it be artistic work with it, for example. And I was thinking, actually, can you apply the word vulnerability to the archive itself, so as thinking of it not maybe like as a place that it can be very fixed and very maybe problematic to access in a way, or can you think of it as an organism, so that it's also easier to access if it has this kind of vulnerability attached to it. So if it's something where you actually can do maybe something, especially when talking about then certain types of archives, it can result in controversial actions, but that's the case also when it sounds like a debatable artistic action. I don't know if I'm very clear here, but to me it's interesting, like how could like institutions help to create, to craft a culture of vulnerability in terms of then working and with material, with a lot of materials, with archives. I don't know if I'm making sense here.
Maybe I'd like to respond briefly with reference to one concept and with one kind of practice. In the conversations that I mentioned that I've had with Bonaventure Ndikung, who happens also to be a biotechnologist, he introduced the word that I wasn't aware of, apoptosis. Apoptosis, apparently, don't quote me on this, but we'll look it up again, is cell death. Not negative, but actually reproductive cell death. That is to say, when an organism sheds parts of itself in order to reproduce and regenerate itself. And he spoke of that in the context of archives, saying that what we should get away from is an idea that archives, and this is perhaps also encapsulated in the films of Alain René about the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, we often think of archives as places where things die. They go and die. They're preserved for forever, but they die. They should just stay there, basically, as tombs that we build cathedrals around, and so on and so forth. But how about conceiving and thinking of archives as spaces where we lend out things that might not come back because they get another life somewhere else? That requires an understanding of the archiving and of objects, of materials that we don't keep to preserve, but that we keep to wait until they receive a proper, different kind of function. That's one aspect of that, of that way of making archives vulnerable. The other one has to do with a slight expansion of the idea of an archive into the idea of a collection. what curators such as Clémentine Delis have tried to do in Frankfurt and other ethnological museums have followed suit a little bit at least, is to try and open up the 95% of the objects that are not seen in most museums, art, but also anthropological ones, that are deep down in storage, away from public view, away from light, and might never see the light of day again. And to open these up in order, first of all, to make them accessible for provenance research, but also to actually generate new kinds of questions, and possibly even to risk their repatriation or to risk their use, their Abnutzung, of which I currently can't think of the English word for. I think that would be a way of making archives in the extended sense vulnerable.
I would maybe like to answer this question again with an example from the art education program, which is kind of having space for the first time in a huge sense in this gallery space. I'm very glad about this. And if you look back, you find like a materialized archive of a process we had here with pupils from the Oberstufenzentrum of Mode und Gestaltung. And they were invited to, in kind of a way, deconstruct the gallery space. We had a conversation together with the artist Ezra Ersen. And the pupils decided to reconstruct the whole ground floor of the gallery with textiles. And you can see on the screens the performance they did in the gallery space, where they folded and unfolded the gallery space. And what is left is the object there on the ground floor, kind of hidden today. And for me, it's kind of a materialized art, archive, which will go to life again now after this exhibition. Which will get back to the school, and they will work to continue working with this textile and giving this gallery floor a new sense. So this is what happened kind of behind the scenes, which it's a process which worked for many months, and just to contextualize this kind of work. Thank you.
We'll take one or two more questions if there are any, because there is also wine and other drinks that will allow us and facilitate conversation in a more informal way. There's one more, yeah.
My question is, in this crossover from visual anthropology for archive and culture and urban anthropology in making art and showing it, how do you think to work without to make a crash, or without to take out the dialogue between visual anthropology, archive, and culture and urban anthropology, the analysis of we are doing?
I'm not entirely sure that I get the question right. Could you maybe rephrase it slightly?
Yes, okay, because you are talking about anthropology. Anthropology, we have different approaches and different theories and different works. And in the archive, we are working here with visual anthropology. And I noticed you work on the way as we have in Marseille, in Sorbonne. And at the same time, you are working with urban anthropology, analysis and dialogues and discussions about doing art and the effect of this art on the people and in the culture you are working for. My question is, how do you think to work on this atmosphere, in this context, without to have a conflict between the two different way of working or seeing the same subject?
I'll try and do that briefly. I don't make those distinctions necessarily, but I'd like to invite you, and in fact all of you who are interested, to a talk by the visual anthropologist and urban anthropologist Andrew Irving, who happens to be director of the Granada Center for Visual Anthropology in Manchester. And he is coming to a seminar series that I'm organizing at our institute on the 5th of June. Check it out again on our website at the Institute of European Ethnology. But he's giving a talk about the difficulties of doing visual and urban anthropology at the same time. And he's giving a workshop right after his talk as well. So yeah, I would just point you towards that. And I just wanted to say somebody's been raising their hand the whole time, so maybe I would just...
Michael Küppers, ADBC, Afro-Tag TV, Cyber Nomads. I'm just going to do a fast thank you for all the input and all the vulnerability and all the possibilities, the potential that is opening up. I'm just going to do a fast run through of the impressions that I gathered today. One of the terms is collaboration, archive, Humboldt Forum, history, koloniale Vermächtnisse, Afrotopia as a utopia maybe. So I'm going to start on the collaboration. Collaboration for me comes from a term of war in a sense. The archive in a postmodern sense I first experienced in the realm of art as stretched out by Envesor when he did the short century. The largest archive, the longest archive, living archive in Germany is Afro-Tag TV's Cyber Nomads. We started in the 80s, and it is very easy to use the archive as a revolutionary force if you consider yourself as a force of history. The Humboldt Forum, it's very interesting that both of you consider yourselves as not collaborating with the Humboldt Forum, coming back to the terms of war. History and her story, where we're all part of writing it, with each move that we're doing, so that part is part of the archive again, which is a very central term today. I'm reading koloniale Vermächtnisse, and that probably has to be deconstructed in English, because part of the word Vermächtnisse is power, Macht. And without power, either top-bottom, from above down, or bottom-up, as maybe more evolutionary, revolutionary, we have to step out of the galleries, the archives, into life and reappropriate what and where we are coming from in order to be able to do so. So performance just in itself will not be able to do that. And Afrotopia, I was talking to Walter Mignolo in Florence in 2015 when we were part of the decolonization project in Florence. And one of his books is something like The Dark Side of Colonialism. And I asked him if in the present he would write the book again, whether he still would call it The Dark Side or maybe The White Side. I don't know whether you get that. I don't have so much time, but he was not amused. Okay. Well, enough for today.
I would almost leave that as a statement, except that I would like to pick up your point on collaboration, because it is very true, especially as someone carrying a German passport and son of a German teacher who's been engaging with the legacy of the Third Reich, as someone my age in 68, das Wörterbuch des Unmenschen, of course, a dictionary written about the terminology and way in which the German language has been, I think, and should be for a long time tainted by the atrocities committed during the Third Reich. I think that term is fundamentally problematic, and I think you're absolutely right that it needs to be interrogated. On the other hand, in a largely English-speaking context, there are other ways in which you could make it work, cooperation and so on, but I just wanted to appreciate that comment and that point. In terms of collaboration with the Humboldt Forum, I actually would like to think that for an institution that claims to be about the conversation between Germany and the world, in a sense we should all be collaborating critically and reflexively, because we're all meant with this institution, we're all spoken for. And so in that sense, I think the work that you and others are doing is exactly raising your hand and saying, excuse me, I did not ask to be spoken for. But other than that, I would just like to leave that as a comment. Yeah.
Thank you for this statement. There were 3 points that were raised, and we can discuss the rest afterwards. But one point of the translation of the colonial legacies. We had several conversations about that. Which word do we use? Vermächtnis, Erbe, and it's still, there are the difficulties of translating this approach of legacy. When you were talking about the power, I think the power is something, it's necessary. When you're talking about the power also up to bottom or bottom up, it is also an approach that has been inspiring the colonial legacies and contemporary society, the Anti-Totai program. Because when I was referring to the exhibition of Chiara Bertola, this Terre Vulnerabili, the full title is Terre Vulnerabili, the power bottom up. So the question of it is something that we have to regain. Why should the power belong only to the other one? Why shouldn't there be a power in the vulnerability? And before, when I was talking about it's not a naivete, it's not coming from a weak position, it is a conviction. And I'm deeply convinced that we can change the approach of power as something negative, but more as something in dialogue with the other one. And this vulnerability, I think, is a statement also, it's a powerful position. Voilà. But voilà, that's it. I think we had one last question.
I'm totally a random. I just walk and just see I have no idea what's going on except reading what's written. And as someone from a continent and a country who's, I'm not using the word, the past is colonized, we're still, whatever's the fact of it. It's really interesting because it seems like every time then the world is changing, and we are lost from the beginning. Now it's gallery, we used to be a museum. And as you then, what is then now the different than now? It's like, because as we know, it's just like with museum now, it's like if you go into different countries, in London, in Paris, everything and what happened in the museum is just been stolen from our continent, that it's now exposed there. Now it's like, okay, it's changed to be like a gallery, and it's presenting like art, and but as I said, I'm totally random. I just came in, and then I was say, okay, but vulnerability and Curatorial, the French president told us not to speak French because, and then we were like, what? What are you talking about? It's this as our culture is like, and it's changing. It's confusing us as being colonized, because then we every time to follow into them, because first of all, it's not our mother tongues that we have to talking about, either the colonial language, French, Portuguese, or English. And then that's why we are confused. Me, by myself, is like, what is now the difference then now with gallery and museum, and what will be the next word? And sorry.
No, thank you for that. And it's quite a starting point for someone who just got in the gallery. So really, thank you for taking the courage to say that. Very briefly, the whole approach of this gallery is to talk about colonial legacies as something in the now. And for that, we have made a big effort to create a digital platform where all of the conversations are available online, where you can listen to that and read some text on people who have been very involved into the same questions you were raising. So it's been a year now. We will still continue. Like tomorrow is the last day of this interloop program, and then we will start the second phase, which is starting as a first point, this colonial structure in the everyday, to talk about movement and migration as strategies to go beyond this colonial structure. So just stay tuned and come back for the opening on June 1st. And I invite everyone for a glass of wine, and we can of course continue the conversation, but I think for us it would be great if we can really meet with you, and because we have, like, there is still this architecture that we are still trying to break of we are talking, and it's a little bit sometimes boring. So let's continue the conversation around a glass of wine, please. Merci.